So if you click this video, it's possible you've played PGA DFS on DraftKings and FanDuel before, maybe without a ton of success overall, or maybe you found my channel for the first time today just because you're trying to get a little bit more up to speed on fantasy golf before a major, put a little bit of skin in the game. Either way, guys, I'm about to give you 25 fantasy golf tips I wish I knew sooner for my PGA DFS strategy on DraftKings and FanDuel, and we're starting right now. First way that you're going to score points that we should talk about is just via the score that each golfer makes on the hole. So whether it's an eagle, birdie, a par, or maybe even a double bogey or bogey, it's definitely going to generate fantasy points in either the positive or the minus direction. So the one thing that I should mention right off the top is that birdies and eagles are actually weighted compared to bogey points. So basically you get 3 points for a birdie, you only lose half a point for a bogey. So at face value, you kind of know immediately if two guys are going to shoot 72, you'd rather have the guy who's making 6 birdies and 6 bogeys rather than the guy that's just making 18 pars. It's just definitely the first thing you're trying to understand with the scoring elements is just the relationship between the variance of those birdies and bogeys, and also just trying to get guys that score points for their placement and finish position. So that's one of the things that we can definitely touch on in a little bit more detail in another video, but it definitely matters a lot. The place points matter a ton, and almost more than the scoring events at times. Just there's not as many birdies to be made on some courses, where at other events, whether it's an easier course or an easier field, they might not make quite as much of an impact on the DK scoring. It's just something that we always talk about. It matters a ton if you're going to finish in the top 20 in 20% of the events this year. But as far as the DraftKings scoring overall, you'd actually rather that top 20 and like 40%, especially at the top end, if you're going to need those guys to win the event to be competing in tournaments. But at the lower end threshold, where there's just guys that are just simply making the cut, the DK scoring is really what separates those players. Generally, a winning GPP lineup is going to require 6 of 6 players to make it through the cut. Not a big shocker there, but the research that I did do in terms of if making the cut is a distinct skill in itself as opposed to just playing good golf in general, it's really the same question as if birdie makers is a distinct skill, right? Are the high variance players, guys that may go birdie bogey more often than par par, more valuable? And it's honestly, it's really easy to separate that out in terms of which golfers who just score generally well. But what I did find was just evidence that supports that cut makers are in a particular a skill in itself. So isolating players like Matt Kuchar, who are just known for consistently making the cut, but you may be giving up a little bit of upside in terms of their ability to finish in the top 25. Obviously, you want to have a little bit of both in terms of DFS and just trying to get to the top of these tournaments, but volatility isn't necessarily a bad thing in a sport like this, especially when there's all the money is up top in these tournaments these days on DraftKings and FanDuel. So although I do believe making the cut is a distinct skill on its own, one thing is definitely for certain you need to do, especially in tournaments, is you have to get these 6 of 6 golfers through the cut if you want the chance at a legitimate sweat. So that's like honestly one of the best things about PGA DFS. It's kind of the worst in some ways too. So you have the sweat on Friday and who's going to make the cut, which is absolutely amazing. And then it just totally depends. Like it's the best. Like your guy's one stroke away from the cut line. He's coming down the back line, and all you need for a 6 of 6 is for him to make a birdie. And you know at this point, if he makes a par or a bogey, you're really dead at that point. But if he does make it, you're live for some serious money. It's pretty crazy. It's one of the better sweats, I think, in DFS. And it's just one of those things that any lineup that you make most weeks, it's probably 20% to get guys through the cut. All 6 is at best, even though you kind of need to make your way through, kind of if you're playing MME, something like that. Hopefully you're just really focused on getting a good percentage of those through in terms of the rest of the field. We're trying to beat others, obviously, right? So I definitely think golf, more than other sports, is a sport where I do like to play multiple entries. You don't have to go full 150 max or anything like that, but it is tough to be all in on one lineup knowing that you're roughly 80% to be dead on the weekend anyways. Regardless, that double sweat is what's so fun about PGA DFS. You get that Friday sweat and then that sweat down the stretch. You may want to get as many of 6 of 6 through the cut as possible, but you really just want to give your chance to move up those leaderboards on the rest of the tournament while the rest of the guys are kind of watching on TV. It's a tough thing to do in general, just to get 6 of 6 golfers through, but you want to make sure when you do, you're capitalizing on it with a little bit of upside. So just starting with the basics, you certainly want to target these guys that can get birdies on a week in, week out basis. And at that point, you're kind of hoping for the best, but targeting scores is more important now, I believe, than it was in the past. You'll see some of these golf courses just playing a little bit easier with the technology and the advancements in golf balls, all of those type of things, just people doing the right types of training during the off season. Everything's just bigger and better now. These guys are basically just completely different level in terms of how they can hit the ball and how close they can get depending on pin placement on a given hole. It's just one of those things where we see a lot of these courses play easier than they did 3, 4, even 5 years ago, because everyone's hitting the ball further off the tee and they've got shorter clubs in their hands for their second shots. It's just a more important thing to target scorers than it was in the past, because the way fantasy point systems are set up, again, another thing we talked about before, just how important it is to know your scoring. They're just going to reward these birdies a lot of times. So like the prime example that I always look at is Tony Finau, because he's one of those guys that can come in 30th or 35th place, but he could still finish 8th or 10th in fantasy point scoring because he takes a lot of chances and he makes a lot of birdies. So targeting those scores, he's always the first example that comes to my mind, and it's something you're going to want to look at on courses where there's birdies to be had. And that said, it's really a tough concept to separate out players that are just generally good versus the ones that are going to be primary scorers. But you're finding people that are just strong analytically in terms of strokes gained, tee to green. For any of those metrics you're looking at, you're generally also going to be targeting guys that are good at making birdies. So it's a tough on a week-to-week basis to figure out who's going to be one of those top scorers, but that's kind of the fun of this game overall. The sample size can certainly be polluted a little bit in some of those metrics based on some good putting, lucky performances, that sort of thing, as opposed to just being generally good at golf. But I do think that those metrics, there are some that are more stable than others as far as making week-to-week predictions and forecasting performances, but we'll definitely get into that. Certainly, there's courses that play longer, courses that play shorter. There's some that have more water hazards or bunkers than others, and it's wide open. It's not wide open. It's very narrow. There's certain things that I've found that these are the ones that definitely control the narratives as far as the content, the articles, the podcasts, that sort of thing, and all the conversation that's happening throughout the week. But I do think that it's most notable if we're trying to project ownership in this type of sport. We're trying to get to the top of GPPs, and there's going to be a lot of randomness involved as well. Each course is certainly a lot different. I think that there's some that have unique characteristics, but I think you really want to focus on the outliers in terms of these sort of things. So the really short or narrow courses versus the super long courses. What I've found is that course fit is actually not very predictive from a mathematical perspective, and kind of the same way as the community talks about in NFL DFS about how defense doesn't matter. I do think that there is at least some underlying truths in terms of the data, at least, and it's not really just adding a ton to our models and predictive value. So if anything, I would say that the course fit conversation in the PGA DFS community, while it's good content, I often don't think that it steers people onto the right plays. It just steers people towards the same plays, and not necessarily from a predictive perspective. It's more of a descriptive type of metric, and I think that sometimes people just need a reason to take guys. Other than that, his odds look good, something like that in terms of the Vegas lines, but maybe he's a little bit underpriced, that sort of thing. I honestly think that that's where the discussion heads with course fit direction more than it should at times. It's hard to extract that predictive value from that type of analysis. But that said, it doesn't mean that descriptive analysis is completely out of context or completely worthless. I definitely think that compiling a list of players that should play well at this type of golf course can still help you in the game of DFS in terms of golf, and knowing where the public is headed is where I would use this information. And whether it's a really long golf course where you want a bomber, a narrow course where you just want to have someone that tends to hit it straight on their irons. And I just think a lot of it is course dependent in general, but I definitely want to give bigger weight to what this affects ownership in terms of it's going to give me an edge or not to these golfers that really need to be playing well on those types of courses, sure, but they also still need to run really hot in terms of their putting and scoring and that sort of thing. So I think that if there's more impact on it if you find these golfers on certain courses that can scramble well. I believe in that a little bit more, but I do think that the course fit conversation is a little bit overblown in terms of beating others in DFS. High course difficulty situations in terms of PGA DFS, and it's a question a lot of novice players have, is if they should be prioritizing more consistency, maybe taking on a little bit less volatility in those scenarios. And what stands out to me here is the majors, and I think it's a spot where we know that some of the best players in the world can miss cuts. Anything can happen. So in those scenarios, I think that basically avoiding bogeys versus getting birdies, it's something that kind of just goes hand in hand. If you're targeting players near the top in terms of bogeys or birdies over the last 6 events or so, they're definitely going to be near the top in terms of bogey avoidance and the birdie side of things. So I think that's kind of where we find ourselves on the more expensive golfers, is where that comes into play, because as you go down, the variance kind of creates itself. So there's definitely events where you look at the scoring. So we'll use the US Open versus like the Greenbrier, for example, where scoring can certainly be even par winning as far as the US Open. There's not going to be many birdies that are made overall versus the Greenbrier. You know, you want a guy that's going to make 6 or 8 birdies in a round to really even have a chance. And if he has, 2, 3, 4 bogeys, he can definitely make up for those with those birdies on a course where you can definitely make a lot of scoring. So there's some volatility there in those lower scoring events in terms of the metrics overall. I think it's a tougher course is basically where you kind of need to place that emphasis on finishing position because it matters that much more when there's not as much scoring happening. So you want to try and get those guys that are going to finish in the top 10, maybe take a few more chances on the easier courses where you really want to maximize the number of birdies they can get. Of course, you're trying to maximize the number of rounds that they get, but maybe you sacrifice a little bit of upside for a little bit more cut equity, and then that way you get as many rounds as possible on the easier course where guys end up going to rack up those birdies. Of course, sometimes a winning score can be 20 under par, and then in the US Open, like I mentioned before, maybe the winning score is even par. So those are the type of events where it's harder to get those birdies, and it means placement points matter just so much more. So even in cash games or something like the US Open, I think it's generally optimal to pay up for some of the highest priced golfers because then you can kind of get someone who's going to get that top 5 finish where it really matters and really going to grab those scoring points. It gets difficult to offset guys that aren't making the cut, but also in those contests where you really want to have those guys on your roster where it's just a birdie fest overall in those other contests, you want to go a little bit more balanced, I think, on those type of golf courses. So especially if there's a cut in the event, like just because a missed cut and a missed round on the weekend could be just like 30 DK points in itself or so. So that's just at the simplest level. I think in the harder tournaments, I think paying up for those top end players is the more viable strategy that I've found so far. I just think looking at the courses over the last couple of years, you kind of know on average which ones are out there that are going to be a little bit tougher and they're going to be adjusted a little bit more. The other piece is just the weather issue. So the wind, that sort of thing, the conditions, that's certainly something that can change year to year, month to month, but there's a little bit of nuance here that we haven't talked about. I think that if it ends up being a spot where the winds end up being really strong, I definitely think that in that particular event, guys that tee off at different times is something you can look at. Maybe someone that goes a little bit earlier in the morning might avoid some of that is something you can consider. But I do think that there's times where it goes a little bit overblown in terms of the weather and the winds. I definitely think that it does impact scoring environment, but for the tournament as a whole, it's really tough to really peg down guys that are going to be playing on different tee times, but that's a big impact of the course difficulty as well. So I think it's something we certainly need to kind of put into our analysis and trying to continue to improve on. Building 150 lineups for PGA DFS on DraftKings and FanDuel. And just to start, I definitely think there's a couple different ways you can go about it. One is just the player pool, filtering it down. And I do think that just targeting guys that have at least 15% odds to top 20 is something that I found as a decent threshold if you want to filter it down right away. Depending on the field, of course, I might even cut that number to 20% odds in the top 20 just because you're really going to have all of your guys inside the top 20 to get up to some of these large field tournaments. So if you're really just taking long shots to even make the cut, there's just not going to be enough up there to really matter and really have the ability to go all the way down in the player pool. So I think the player pool is one thing that I think I'm always conscious of. And if I'm really trying to grab guys that are going to be low owned, I still want to try and create a decent lineup around that. I don't think you have to be super contrarian. I think you can be smart contrarian, I think is a good way to set it. And one way to do that is by setting a max ownership threshold on the optimizer of your choice. Really just the choice of those lineups is just, I found the sweet spot for total ownership of your lineup is somewhere between 90 and 105%. So if you're really just trying to play guys that are 25% owned, you're at least kind of matching with some of those 5% owned guys as well. And I think that you really have to think about the ownership as a whole of your lineup if you're really trying to be unique. So that's like the last part about MME specifically, unless you really have that huge bankroll. I think it's kind of reckless to go all in on any individual golfer. And I think you're really trying to diversify your exposure is kind of a better way to put it and stay around long term in terms of this. I think there's a argument that's just in favor of there's just a lot of randomness in terms of golf in general, in terms of DFS, and it's really hard to get 6 of 6 guys through the cut. It's even harder to pick winners. So you could either easily just go 2 or 3 months losing all of your money over that time period. So it's always something that I want to try and mention to people. Like, this is a really tough sport to do effectively in terms of GPPs, and it's totally normal to have those periods of downswings. And I think that if you're going to try and turn a profit in the long term, you really have to try and work your way through that and work through your process. If you're going to MME, that's just really one of those spots where you can kind of try and control your ownership a little bit to limit your downside, but also think that the cap of ownership of individual players is a little bit I guess, underutilized. I'm never going all in. I definitely think that a good way to do it is just to limit the ownership of your lineup as a whole. Just hoping to get some of those more unique teams just to hopefully withstand a little bit of that variance, but definitely keep an eye on like what types of tournaments you're playing and make sure you can sustain for the long term. I think it's super important for MME. Certainly if you're rolling out 150 lineups, I think there's two main approaches that can be successful. And I'm not a guy that likes to lock in on a specific golfer at 100%. I'm typically just not even approaching 80%, anything like that, because I think the sport has way too much variance. And honestly, if your guy misses the cut that you end up locking in or even end up being super exposed to at that end, it kills your week right away. So the method that I prefer is to keep some of even my high-end golfers at the 50% range. More often than not, I'm going to cap around 30 to 40%, but I'm going to limit my player pool a lot more. So on a given week, I would rarely have more than 25 golfers in my player pool, even if it's a larger field event. I think that would be my cap. If it's a smaller field, I can even see myself getting down to like 18 golfers. You certainly won't see me playing more than 25 on most weeks. And like I said, I'm going to cap my high-end guys at about 50%, but the lower-end guys, I actually will move it down to about 15 to 20% ownership. I want to have a little bit more of a spray approach at the bottom end, but typically just trying to keep that smaller player pool overall and get the combinations that I want is one of the approaches that I like to do. But the second method is just extending it a little bit. So like 35 golfers or so. Kind of the playable guys, usually that threshold in terms of T20 that we talked about in the other video. But I do think there's a chance that this might be a little bit more thin overall. And there's two different ways within this approach that you can kind of go with in terms of the lower end. I still think capping your top end golfers at 40-50% is probably the max that I would do. But at the lower end, you'll see guys and some really good players really sprinkling some of those more volatile shares, some of the cheaper guys at the bottom end with anywhere from like 5 to 10% on a lot of different players. So hopefully you just end up with that nice combination if the volatility kind of works in your favor and you end up doing a little bit of a shuffle approach at the bottom end. Certainly think that could work out as well. You really want to try and diversify overall, but if you're trying to keep that same level of players in your pool, at least be consistent with it. I think that going with one of these approaches and really trying to get strong and really try and get good at that certain approach is something that you should really work on in your game if you want to be successful playing MME for golf. And I don't think there's direct correlation. I think there's sometimes where you can talk a little bit about weather and tee times and that sort of thing, which we'll get into in a minute. But I do think there might be an angle in terms of correlating indirectly with individual skill sets. And it's something that could happen organically depending on how you're using course fit and that sort of thing. But if a golf course is going to play a certain way and you're not sure which way it's going to be based on bombers versus some guys that maybe are better at scrambling or with their irons, I think you can skill set kind of different batches of groups of lineups together. And if you end up hitting on the types of the field that end up doing really well on a given contest, you'll have some of those skill sets together. So I think that would be how I would approach correlation, but I think that there's a chance that the weather aspect of it is a little bit overblown. But I think if you wanted to kind of group together some guys, if there's going to be a bunch of wind early in the morning and really kind of group together some guys in the afternoon that you think will have better weather draw overall, I think that's something that you can do. But weather's something that it's like one of the last things that I check every week, right? Like so Wednesday night, even Thursday mornings, depending on the week, and certain things where I'm not trying to get away from my core because of that. I think that weather gets overblown in general. I think there's honestly an argument if the field is just going to overblow this entire thing, actually moving some core groups of lineups to basically just grab some lower ownership on some of these like tough weather or tough wind situations early on, just getting drastically lower ownership depending if we're wrong about the weather overall. So something like Jordan Spieth a couple of years ago at Pebble Beach had by far the worst weather draw, and it wasn't even supposed to be a spot where he could make the cut. He ended up winning the entire tournament. So I think there's a way to kind of go about that. I'm not really using that overall in terms of trying to correlate my lineups. Like I would rather have the skill set thing happen organically, but there's some sharp people out there that do that. So I'm not sure it's a huge edge one way or the other, but it's something that I do think that you could try and do if you wanted to get a little bit more unique with your groupings. Golf is a really hard sport to be consistent at week to week, or at least be super consistent at, because I think the community has really embraced over the last couple of years, kind of talking about it from more of a tournament perspective, talking about exposures, that sort of stuff. It's just really hard to predict 6 golfers to get through the cut with the constraints of the DraftKings salary cap. And I think that that's what makes cash games just a really super difficult proposition. And I think the biggest thing is just that the way that the sport is scored, the sample sizes involved just make a lot more sense from a tournament sport in terms of the DFS and kind of weighing exposures and ownership and that sort of thing. Just more having more game theory involved is what I like to do in terms of it. And I do think that just if you wanted to kind of go up in stakes a little bit, I think one thing that I've talked about a lot in terms of my football strategy is playing in the 1,500 and playing against 100 people versus playing against 100,000 people. I think that's something that you could do. Just know that it's not for the faint of heart in terms of golf. I think that you get that Friday cut sweat. It's even more impactful when you have a more of a single entry approach. It is a lot of fun, and everyone's going through the same thing, right? So I do think that there's definitely an argument for attacking some of those smaller fields, but I do like to kind of go with a little bit more of an MME approach in terms of golf. So if you're mass multi-entering, building 150 lineups, you're really just chasing some upside, chasing that big prize at the top. And if you're playing cash games, you definitely want to lean on the more consistent golfers, although cash games certainly not something in terms of contest selection that I typically recommend overall. But when your priority is just getting those 6 guys through the cut, I think that in a no-cut event, you're definitely taking some more volatile guys if you're playing 1 or 2 lineups in a GPP. But even in regular tournaments, there's value in getting all your guys through the cut. So even kind of some of the veterans, the plotters, some guys that maybe make the cut, finish 30th pretty consistently, they still value in DFS, and no matter what contest you're playing. So definitely think that you can't just completely write those guys off, even if they aren't consistently threatening for a top 5 performance. You're just starting to get to this spot in smaller fields, whether you just need to get those guys through the cut. If you want to triple, double your money, that sort of thing, just kind of trying to build up your bankroll. I'm not sure that golf is the best way to just consistently build up a bankroll. I actually like using it as more of a sport to have a little bit more spike appeal in tournaments. But honestly, ownership is something that gets really inflated overall in terms of the community relative to how strong we are actually predicting the way things that are going to kind of play out. So contrarian strategy in golf can certainly work. It's just definitely you want to be smart about the stakes that you're playing, and you want to be able to really try and focus on kind of keeping your bankroll at a spot where you're alive to play throughout the entire season. So I would say whatever you're playing for other sports, I would scale it back even more for golf, just to make sure you can make your way through some of the swings if you're playing tournaments only. Are cash games viable? Now, over the years, I've kind of reduced my cash game exposure overall, pretty much in all sports, because I think as the industry gets smarter, the edge in cash games definitely gets a little bit smaller. So I still play a little bit depending on the sport, but mostly interested in kind of the single entry 3 max tournaments at this point in certain spots. But I do think that small field going up in stakes a little bit is an approach that I have been successful in terms of NFL. Golf's a little bit different. I think it's one of those spots where cash games and kind of working through those pivots is something that's worked for me in other sports, but I found to be more profitable in terms of golf, just kind of focusing on the tournament side of things. I do think that there's a chance out there that there's a little bit of an edge in double ups and head-to-heads, that sort of thing. But I think that if it's going to be a similar cash line overall to some of the GPPs out there, I just would prefer to have the upside there. So if you wanted to kind of choose between double ups and head-to-heads, it's basically what kind of player are you? Do you want to be one of those guys that's okay with returning $0 if you just missed that cash line in a spot where if you just would have had all head-to-heads in that sort of tournament, you probably would have gotten some back. I guess it's tougher to sweep overall, so it's really about your goals in terms of your cash game tournaments that you want to play. I will say that as you go up in dollar amount in almost any sport, but definitely in golf, it certainly gets tougher. So I wouldn't recommend really going outside of your means. And if you do want to play cash games, if you're set on that, I would really stick to maxing out the $1 to $3 level first, because then you'll make sure you avoid some of the better players overall. And it's also a little bit more predictable overall what types of lineups will be on those type of cash game teams, especially in golf. So one thing that I will say in terms of like a final note on cash games, one thing that I would say is scaling it up for the majors, things like the Masters, certainly makes a lot of sense. There's going to be a lot more casual money that comes in. So I'll definitely try and get some head-to-head action and 50-50 action, double ups, that sort of thing, when I know there's going to be a lot more casual players in the field that just might make more egregious mistakes. Some of the millionaire maker analysis that I've done is typically surrounded about the majors, because that's where a lot of the casual players will be involved, and they're using a lot of the salary cap, and the results were pretty shocking. To paraphrase, it's just something like 75% of the people leave $200 or less on the table with their lineup. So if you leave just $300 on the table, only 25% of the overall lineups are leaving at least that much. So you really don't need to beat the entire field. You just want to beat the smaller portion of the field that doesn't have overlap if you want to have the chance at getting that top prize. So, in terms of GPP size, if you're in a 100-man GPP or a 200-man GPP, I think you can just play your best team at that point. But if you're firing at some of these really large field $100,000 tournaments with 50K to first, 100K to first, $1 million in some of those majors. I honestly think that it's definitely the way to go just to get unique teams in there. I think you can leave up to $500 on the table depending on the type of contest it is. If you really want to try and get unique, I think it's okay to leave that much and really not worry too much about it, just because golf is such a variant sport in general. If you look at DraftKings, the difference between a salary of a $9,500 golfer and $8,500 golfer really isn't that much in the grand scheme of things. But if it's going to lead you to a more unique team, that's what you want to take advantage of. If you're trying to get that big upgrade, everyone's going to try and do this, right? Like if they can upgrade a guy for another $200 that they think is in a better spot, all of that, they're probably going to end up holding hands with some portion of the field that thought the same thing. So you want to consider the leverage that you get by leaving that money on the table and not using your entire salary cap. So whether you're using $600, $800 with the lineup, it's not something that I really try and actively get away from if I think I'm getting on a good core of my lineups in general. And I think that I can feel pretty good that the casual player is going to try and use that a lot. But one of the things that I will say is no cut events in general. So there's no way I'm spending the $50,000 cap in a no cut event, because the statistics show that even in a no cut event, using the full cap, the likelihood of being duplicated is just so high. Even your best lineup, even if you win the GPP, you're going to be splitting those with a bunch of other people, and it's just not something you want to do. I want to have that chance of having an unduplicated lineup in these tournaments where all the money is typically up top and the most money is to first place. The difference between DraftKings and FanDuel in terms of PGA scoring, and overall it is pretty similar. FanDuel has kind of refined their scoring a little bit since they first launched their golf product a couple of years back, but it is a little bit similar. What's not similar is that FanDuel tends to have a much looser salary cap overall. This has been pretty consistent pretty much throughout every week, but DraftKings loosens it up a little bit for the majors, which is interesting, to where they're a little bit more similar. But when you kind of see some of the higher price guys be higher owned on FanDuel because their pricing tends to be so much softer, but yeah, you'll get those guys that are like 35-40% over there. It's a little bit different dynamic, because when you want to build over on DraftKings and then you go build on FanDuel directly after, it's just so much easier to build a lineup. It's like almost like, how can I get this lineup on FanDuel? It's something that happens across a lot of different sports, but definitely something that is happening in golf. So you kind of make an argument that there's a little bit more game theory involved at times on FanDuel, just because there's so much more ownership towards some of the best plays because they're just severely underpriced. So for the most part, I think it's just a variation of scoring is relatively similar, but the pricing is what's different. The metrics are going to be similar, the same things you're going to be looking at. One thing that is a little bit different, I guess you could say, is that on FanDuel versus DraftKings is you have kind of those streaky bonus type metrics on DraftKings. And I think when you're kind of identifying like what fundamentals you're going to be trying using in terms of trying to identify value, who's going to be on the winning lineup, basically the same thing for FanDuel. I don't sweat differentiating my pool too much on FanDuel versus on DraftKings. And it's one of those things that I think that the bonuses actually hurt things overall, in my opinion, in some ways. Like, for what reason should this arbitrary number give someone a bonus based on what they did versus another guy that might have done a couple other things better but just didn't hit that random streak or something like that? So that's one thing that I don't really like the bonuses overall across a lot of different sports, but I think that's one of the things that can kind of lead to a little bit more fun for the casual player, but also a little bit more volatility for some of the sharper players, which isn't always the best thing overall. But one thing that I do like in terms of the DraftKings versus FanDuel debate in PGA is I really like the idea of kind of leveraging ownership even more on FanDuel, which has been a lot of fun. It is a little bit more fun to build lineups over there as well too, when you can kind of get in more of the studs that you want to play and maybe not get quite as thin. There's actually a couple different formats that we'll have to talk about here. So there's round 1, round 2, round 3 showdown. That is just one round. It's literally just birdies and bogeys, and it's all about the scoring points. But there's also weekend golf, which used to be big, and they're starting to bring it back a little bit, and that's just the 3rd and 4th rounds. And again, just the scoring points, birdies and bogeys, and then the 4th round showdowns are actually unique. Just because in South, it kind of mirrors what the main slate is, because they're taking into account the finishing position and the scoring there as well. So like the pricing is actually moved towards the end of round 3 before it's finalized, just so that you make sure that you get these guys that might be more live to win being more expensive, that sort of thing. So if you make a change late on Saturday, they can end up being really big values if someone makes like a late charge, I should say, on Saturday, because maybe the pricing has already been set for the round 4 showdown. So on these slates, the scoring is a little bit different as well. It's kind of crazy. There's more emphasis on birdies overall. I think it's 5.25 for birdies, but it's also more emphasis on bogeys. So essentially, it's the regular round scoring on steroids for the most part. Finishing position is what really matters with the Sunday contest. So on Friday, Saturday, just regular scoring. Sunday for the showdown, you get more points for that finishing position. So everyone gets kind of loads up to the guys at the very top. Everyone's like 80% or so. It's kind of good game theory, actually, because those prices for those higher guys usually end up being the ones where if someone really tanks on the last day, you can kind of leap the field a little bit. So it's kind of an interesting wrinkle. I do think that there's some courses where it actually matters too, where they're going to be starting on that specific course. And if you end up getting 2 par 5s in a stretch of 2 or 3 holes on a showdown slate, you definitely think of how that par 5 scoring might be more impactful as far as generating birdie streaks from there. So I do think that that's something that the projections that you are using kind of take into account a little bit on what holes the guys are starting on, but sometimes certain golfers get to play that stretch of 3 holes with 2 par 5s is really valuable on showdown slates, and other guys maybe starting on the back 9 where he's not going to get that opportunity. So there's definitely a little bit of nuance there for showdown. And I would say that another thing is just the wind. We've talked about weather before, but it can definitely have a big impact on the showdown slates. It's really hard to predict the weather a day or two in advance, but you know exactly what the wind should be like for that 1 day slate. So if you're kind of trying to leverage that, I do think it's interesting if there's going to be certain players that get soft conditions where they're not going to have too much wind. There could be an edge in taking that into account when you're building your showdown lineups on DraftKings. Short-term form, course history, it all kind of drives the Vegas odds, and the Vegas odds are what drives the DraftKings and FanDuel pricing. So I actually think that even if there was merit to course history, just as an example, I actually think that how this person's done at the event previously, it's all kind of priced into the Vegas odds anyway. So it's priced into the DraftKings pricing. So I actually think that, like, if you're using course history as more of a predictive measurement, I actually think that it might actually make you overdo it a little bit, because it kind of drives a lot of the conversation around the community, and there's a lot of good sites out there that take that into account. But I honestly think that just using the Vegas odds will get you about halfway there anyway if you're just looking at the pricing inefficiencies and that sort of thing. So I actually think that there's certain things that people will find as an automatic value. This guy has these odds and he has this price, so he's automatic chalk in that way. And on top of it, if he does have course history backing him up, that just makes him even more popular in the industry, because what everyone's talking about, that low price guy that stands out from those two perspectives. So I actually think in a tournament sport like golf, and where there's a lot of randomness overall, I actually think that if there's going to be a guy like that maybe has lower odds to win, but just has these weird course history, but his Vegas odds might be a little bit over whack, he's going to be over owned as just a general rule of thumb. You might not need him. If he doesn't get there, you're already passing a lot of the field anyway, but trying to get a little bit more, I guess, useful in terms of what metrics you're going to be using, and just trying to use the Vegas odds as more of a line of ownership, not necessarily just a predictive measurement on what you should be going to already in terms of guys that are overpriced or underpriced. The way we look at long-term form, it's how golfers have performed over the last 2 years. Short-term form is how they've been playing over the previous 3 months. So definitely course history is baked into the longer-term aspect of it as well, specifically how the golfer has done at that track before. So what most of the projections out there will do is they'll look at all the data, they'll weigh the rounds 2 years ago, a little bit less than the rounds 23 months ago, and a little bit less than 22, and so on. So they're taking it into account. They're coming into a projection based on how that player is going to do on the given week, based on the kind of rolling basis. It's a little bit of an arbitrary period, but they kind of chop it off and add a little bit more of a predictive power to it. It's almost going to skew towards the longer form stats more often than not, but I would say short-term form is kind of a guy that would be chasing who's hot now. There could be something to the idea that guys are playing well recently translating to that next event, but it's going to be always a little bit noisy and misleading for me, kind of taking the names out of it overall. Like a longer form or a longer term form golfer just is going to show us a while he's one of the best golfers in the world, right? But then short term form, he's really struggled. So like, what do we do with a guy like that? We'll go into the stats, and maybe that golfer has been bad with his putter, or maybe he just hasn't been striking the ball very well. There's certain things that definitely can be a more of a short-term aspect of it, but he was still top 25 in strokes gained, something like that. Those players are really tough to quantify with the projections. Part of the reason that golf has so much variance in it overall. So if you're going to weigh something like short-term form, where maybe he gets in that scenario on the other side of thing, maybe he was making some putts, and you kind of end up in that sweet spot of a guy that's a little bit streakier than others, Yeah, I could see it having some predictive value, but it's just not something we can really quantify with a lot of data just to really try and get that consistency that we do want. And some golfers, I definitely think it's important, but I think 25, I don't know, these guys that are going to be giving us a top 20, top 25 finish week in and week out, I still would prefer to go out for these guys that have a reasonable ceiling and that long-term form. These guys are going to be kind of used in the Vegas odds more often at the top anyways. It depends on kind of the contest each week, but I do think that long-term form is personally what I would prefer to use in my analysis. Know your risk tolerance. Honestly, that's one of the biggest parts about being a successful PGA DFS player on DraftKings and FanDuel, because you can certainly narrow it down in terms of your player pool to a wider range of players to select from, because a lot of people just want to diversify or not necessarily be too exposed to a single player or situation. And honestly, it's really about what your risk tolerance is personally. And that's something only you can tell us. I honestly think that I personally don't mind firing, kind of honing in on a really narrow player pool or group of players in general. If I'm heavily exposed to one or two, three or four guys, I'm okay with the result. Honestly, at that point, you're kind of relying on the variance to help you, but it's also going to hurt you a lot as well. It's just, there's going to be certain times where in a sport like this, where if you're playing all tournaments, maybe scooping up one GPP win a year, which honestly could be max EV in certain situations, depending on what contest you're playing. It's a really high risk lifestyle. A lot of people kind of don't have the patience for it, but I look in like 5-week stretches. If I'm trying to hit maybe once in 5 weeks, or at least have a break even couple slates in there, honestly, over the season, I kind of set up my expectations that if I can hit three or four tournaments a year, honestly, the way that I build, and I know when I'm going to have unique lineups, and when I really do hit that expectation, it's going to make sure it makes up for some of those other weeks. But honestly, it's up to just being patient, trusting your strategy, and really trusting your process along the way if you want to be successful with this. Honestly, putting is just such a big deal in real golf, but does it actually have any impact or predictability if we're trying to use the data to get better at fantasy? I'm not so sure. It's just one of those things that's so volatile overall that a lot of people don't use it in their models. That said, I'm considering at least including it on a really low-key basis on my model, just because even though it is volatile week to week, if you're playing all the time, maybe you can at least realize those benefits eventually over the course of an entire season after kind of many years of like only targeting these ball strikers, but a lot of them just, or at least some of them, are terrible putters. I think I'm at least turning the page slightly here, and that might be kind of an unpopular take, but I definitely think there's some big data as far as guys that have putted historically well on Bermuda glass. I definitely see that a lot more in South Florida, and they have it in Hawaii, I believe, as well. But you'll get some thin grass up north that's just really nice to putt on. And I do think that, like in the past, this isn't something that we can just use to say he hasn't putted well this week, he's definitely not going to putt well next week on the same type of grass. It's not really what I'm saying. I just think targeting strong short game, strong putters overall could be something that could pay off over the longer term, but it's not something that I'm putting a ton of weight into. I just think it's an interesting conversation to have on maybe using it over the course of the entire season on a very small impact on what you're doing in terms of your decision making. Fade the chalk, especially on DraftKings and FanDuel for PGA DFS. I honestly think that for some of the expensive guys like JT, he could get up to like 32, 34% owned, depending on the contest. That's not really a fade for me. I think what it becomes an interesting conversation to have is once it ends up being kind of like these lower tier plays, so like that industry-wide value at like 7,200. Those are the guys that I'd rather pivot away from. I just think that there's so much volatility in a sport like golf. I think that you can really get a lot of kind of leverage in terms of really trying to get different on the value side of things, especially when it's not a top tier golfer. Anytime that guy is going to be more than 15% owned, I definitely consider just crossing them off my list altogether, just unless there's just a extreme value that can't be passed up on, like for some reason DraftKings messed up the pricing, which doesn't happen a whole lot in golf these days anymore. I think that's just one of those things that like it parallels to NFL in this way. So like I think it's like there's always like that super thin cheap wide receiver or just like tight end that everyone wants to jam in and everyone's decided is kind of the best play on the board. A lot of times, if that guy happens to fail in tournaments and you go a different direction at a similar price point, you can really get a ton of leverage on the field, and a very similar thing can do well for you in golf. So that's something that I'm really paying attention to, and just don't be a chalk donkey overall. It's one of the worst sports to just go out there and hold hands with everyone else. You know, all the money is at the top of these tournaments anyway. So I would implore you guys definitely kind of embrace the variance a little bit and make sure that you kind of, if you're going to fade the chalk, do it in a smart way. Don't just fade some of the top guys that legitimately have a chance to win every week. But I do think that getting a little bit different in the long term is definitely the way to go for PGA. Build your PGA DFS lineups on Wednesday at night. You want as much information as you can, especially about weather. In the NFL, honestly, it might be kind of bad to start building your lineup super early in the week. This is just another spot where you have an entire week to agonize over decisions in terms of your PGA decisions. So I really try and make those calls when I have all of the ownership projections completely updated, or at least mostly updated. And then when we have more of an idea of where the field's at in terms of what they're going to be doing in their lineup building process. So I like to listen to those podcasts, Pat Mayo, etc., just to get a sense of what people are thinking and like what other sharp people are finding in their analysis as well. I want to get an idea where the field's going to be at, but also I just want to see what type of information people are going to be taking in. So this Wednesday night thing, that's where I'm looking for where my leverage is. That's where I'm trying to get an idea if there's any weather concerns. Maybe I want to try and avoid guys that are teeing off earlier, that sort of thing. So at that point, I'm almost always going to build my lineups as soon before lock as possible, or leave as much time before lock as possible. I think that's the best strategy for PGA. Basically what strokes gained is, it's how a player performs compared to the average in the field in a given event. So it's broken down in a couple individual metrics. One of those would be strokes gained off the tee, so how a guy is hitting the ball off the tee box relative to the field. Strokes gained on approach shots, strokes gained putting, and then also strokes gained around the green. Of those stats overall, the strokes gained off the tee and approach shots are by far the most consistent and the most predictive on a week-to-week basis. So I think if you're looking at those individually, those are the ones that I would tend to have a little bit more value in, definitely weigh more heavily in my own model. But some of the challenges with strokes gained overall, just the calculations in general, is they don't exist in tournaments without shot link data. So basically what that means is there's going to be certain contests where it's just incomplete, and that's never great. We'll have a record of a lot of golfers that are on a completely different type of tournament. Like basically it's like some of the Euro tournaments are just not going to be with the shot link data, so it's going to be an incomplete sample. If you're really trying to match up these guys versus the field and there's portions of it that's just not going to be involved in your analysis, it's never great, especially in a sport like with a lot of variance like golf. I would prefer to have the most data available, and if anything, some of these things might just end up making your sample even more diluted and really hurt you more than it helps you. So I do think that there's value in strokes gained, but I think you need to approach it as it's definitely not the end all be all for something like DraftKings and FanDuel. You have to know the importance and differences of no-cut events in PGA DFS on DraftKings and FanDuel. These events are just so much different than a normal week, guys. A lot of players, golfers I should say, are as volatile as they are for birdies and bogeys. They're also volatile as far as making the cut. So in a no-cut event, you can actually take on the risk of these players and not really feel as bad about it. We want these volatile players and not really feel any difference towards those type of guys versus these ones we would typically just have in our lineups because they were a good bet to make the cut. So guys who finish 30th or 60th in a no-cut event, there's really not going to be a huge difference in their scoring because they're going to be playing the entire weekend. So this would allow you to pay out for some top-end players without worrying about some of these $6,500 guys missing the cut. You know you're going to get at least 4 guaranteed rounds out of them. So like in a no-cut event, I'm more apt to play more of a stars and scrubs approach. I think it's more of an option. There's more upside there. You can get away with it a little bit more because everyone's going to be getting those 4 rounds, like I said, and there's going to be obviously the risk if someone withdrawals or gets injured. But within like a normal tournament, honestly, I think that they're embracing that volatility. It's extremely important with those type of contests. You're going to be taking more shots and definitely apt to take those riskier golfers that may just make birdies. They could make a ton of bogeys. That's fine. It really doesn't matter. It can only help you in these no-cut events to target those type of players. One of my favorite tips basically across any DFS sport is one of the best ways to use game theory to be unique in tournaments is just to have a different roster construction than the field. It goes back to being contrarian, but also not being dumb. It doesn't mean you have to play all these really thin plays. It means you can have, if like the roster construction in the popular build, the chalk build is more of a stars and scrubs approach, maybe you just have a lot of plays in the mid-range that really make sense to you that week, and then your leverage just based on being unique and using different salary tiers. I honestly think that just having a mid-range team in those type of weeks gives you a lot of leverage on the field that you wouldn't get even if you ended up kind of taking a different approach in the stars and scrubs round. I definitely think that this is a way that I like to do it when I'm kind of paring down my core, trying to figure out what plays, what salary ranges I really like, where the field might be in a different direction. I think that's a great way to be contrarian in PGA and really just be different than the field in addition to kind of leaving some salary on the table here and there. I think that's another great thing to make sure you're not getting duplicates. But if you can just tell this is a week where everyone's building JT lineups, and like I said, I'm just like trying to get to a complete balanced build instead, I think that's a great way to kind of get different. And if you end up in one of those weeks where the chalk construction doesn't pan out and you end up with a lot of really solid lineups that end up being completely different in a smart way, that's really something that goes understated. The way prize pools are structured these days on DraftKings and FanDuel, it's never been more important to have unique lineups. I honestly think that in PGA DFS, the best way to be contrarian is just to give yourself a chance to have that unique lineup. Just leave a little bit of salary on the table. We've talked about this before, but I definitely want to hammer this point home, especially if you want to have as much volatility in there as you can. I'm looking to leverage guys. I'm looking to keep the ownership lower, but I'm always trying to keep the ownership of the entire lineup lower, regardless of the sport that I'm playing. But in PGA, this is absolutely crucial. I'm definitely trying to get a lot more bang for my buck. Think in golf, like especially around the Millionaire Maker and the Masters or the PGA Championship, these really large field tournaments where we get a lot more casual money in the field as well. I think it's something like somewhere over 50% of lineups reach at least 200 or less left on the cap of the salaries. So I think that if you want to differentiate yourself and just all of your equity really is tied up in being different at the top heavy payout structures that these tournaments really have now, you really need to avoid duplicate lineups like the plague. And I definitely think that just make sure you don't spend the cap. I tend to really set mine for some of these really large field majors. I think that you should try and be under at least 500 left on the table, 600 left on the table. That's the range that I would prefer to be in. Don't overspend. It's really the easiest defense you have against getting your lineup duped. Honestly, some of the best weeks I've had in PGA DFS have been when the field only gets about 1% of lineups through the cut, and I have 6 of 6 guys through the cut, right? These chaos weeks. So if you're able to get even like 5 to 10% of your lineups through in a week where most people and a lot of the chalk is doing poorly, that's the week that you wait for. And honestly, I think that that's kind of the contrarian approach that's really helped me in DFS golf. And honestly, the weeks where maybe the field gets 20% through, you kind of just live with those over the long run because it puts you in a much better position to finish up towards the top 10 a couple of times a year. And just to kind of clarify for people that haven't played a lot of PGA DFS, we're not really talking about playing like guys that are like 1% owned here. Like typically you're just looking for guys that are top 20 favorites to win the tournament, but most of them are going to carry around 10% ownership. But really the difference between 10 and 30% ownership is a lot different than just like throwing darts out there. So I would say be contrarian, but be smart about being contrarian in PGA would be the biggest tip that I have for you guys. In general, I try and draw that line because if a guy doesn't have at least 15% odds to finish inside the top 20, I kind of just take him out of my player pool at that point. It's just like the slate size matters, like the tournaments you're playing, all of that matters too. So let's say you're playing a $1,500 buy-in. You really don't have to always have 6 of 6 through the cut just to cash. If you do get that, you're probably live to win. And that's just one of the things that is really tough from a single entry perspective. But if you're playing something like the Millionaire Maker with 150 lineups, just to finish inside the top 20, you really have to have 6 of 6 through, and you have to have a bunch of guys that are finishing up really high in the tournament. So like at that point, you really have to hit on some of your contrarian moves as well. It's definitely possible that you could land on something like that, but that's what we just get down to, the good chalk versus bad chalk. I'm typically just like, I'm more apt to fade the cheap value chalk than the more expensive chalk that still has a reasonable chance to finish up high in the tournament. So I think that if I'm going to really try and get to a position where recency bias isn't going to affect me, and I do think this is one of the sports where there's more recency bias than anything, I think that just going through trying to figure out smart ways to be contrarian but still playing really good golfers, guys that have a chance to finish top 20, has always been my approach in this sport. When it comes to PGA DFS, pricing is mostly efficient, but ownership generally not that efficient on DraftKings and FanDuel. So in general, I think that people just play too much chalk overall. We talked about that in one of the other videos, but in PGA DFS, especially large field tournaments, that's just kind of where I want to separate myself a little bit. Cash games, sure, you might be able to win some weeks with 4 or 6 guys getting through the cut. 5 of 6, you might be looking pretty strong, but if in tournaments, you're really not going to cash unless you get 6 of 6 through. You might not even sniff a min cash at that point. So I do think that you're going to need the winner. You're going to need all 6 golfers to get through the cut. And if you're playing like a super large field tournament, you're also going to need a lot of those guys to finish inside the top 20. Just become something that's like really hard to do to like hit that optimal kind of lineup. So I've found again that pricing is really efficient. The ownership is not. So if we just look kind of at the average performances over the last couple of years, the Vegas odds, DFS pricing, it's honestly roughly where it should be. The DFS market always kind of overreacts, overowns certain guys, certain value plays. So if you're able to get guys that have comparable odds to finish inside the top 20, but maybe get them at 5% ownership instead of like 20%, where some similar guy is at that maybe has a little bit better course history, something like that. Over the long run, that type of stuff is going to add up if you are willing to take on a little bit more of a contrarian approach. So what I typically try and do is try and grab a little bit more leverage, try and identify guys that still could be strong values, but might not be at the high end of the spectrum in terms of ownership, especially those value plays. So I think that if you wanted to focus on guys that can finish inside the top 20, that would be a decent way to go. And you'll get an idea where you should try and be pivoting as well to make sure that you're on the other side and not holding hands with anyone at the top of the leaderboard. If somehow you still didn't get enough DFS tips today, or maybe you want to give another sport a try on DraftKings and FanDuel, consider subscribing to my channel. I have a ton of free educational content available if you're new, and toss me a like on this video before you get out of here. I'd really appreciate it. Check out linemovement.com if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys next time.